Ben Warwick is Chief Investment Officer of Aveo Capital Partners, member of the Board of Advisors at Bulla Network, official member of the Forbes Finance Council, founder and Chief Investment Officer of Quantitative Equity Strategies. Ben also serves on the Board of Regents Investment Committee at Pacific Lutheran University and as member of the Board of Directors at Cross Purpose. Welcome, Ben. Say a few things
Hello.
about yourself.
Well, all of that. And I actually started out my life, I was very, very into science. I studied engineering, chemical engineering, and chemistry and physics in college. Love science. Kind of got bored in my engineering career and decided to go back to school and get an MBA. So I went to UNC Chapel Hill for that and got really intrigued by investing. And I've been in the investing business really since 1990.
It makes a lot of sense for people with a STEM background to go into investing or to get an interest in investment theory because a lot of the great discoveries in investments, like the Black-Scholes formulas for estimating the value baked into changes in prices of commodities and stocks. I see a lot of people who go even from PhD. We have had a PhD out of our material science and nanoengineering department at Rice who went straight into a mathematical job with a commodities company.
And that's actually exactly what I did when I started my career. And what's interesting is you're talking about the Black-Scholes option pricing model
Yes.
for estimating the value of options
Right.
is actually the same formula that's used to design heat exchangers. So that
Really?
was, yeah, it is
So it's
the
all about
exact formula.
change.
It's about change. It's about the speed at which things react to
Hmm.
outside data.
Cool.
That's what it's all about. It's sort of like, if you think about it, the lag that you see when you turn your hot water tap on and
Hmm.
how long does it take for the water to get warm. It's those kinds of things, that those types of observations that really form the foundation for modern finance.
Ah, well, that takes us in a way to our first question. There's a statement on Aveo Capital's website that says, we understand that managing wealth is about people, each with their own definition of financial success. How do you define wealth management in that context, knowing that there's also a big mathematical aspect to it as well? And what does it mean for you that managing wealth is about people?
Great question. Let me tell you the biggest challenge as an advisor. And when I say advisor, financial advisor, it's someone who helps people with their investing and their planning, how they're going to finance their life. The biggest challenge is, we all have an expiration date, just like that milk in your refrigerator.
Right.
One day we're not going to be here. And actually, the Onion had a great headline: "Death rate hovers around 100%." So, so it's pretty darn likely that you're not going to be here unless something really crazy happens. But anyway, here's the deal: if I don't know when you're going to die, it's a lot harder to plan your financial future, right? I mean, if I knew you're going to die next Thursday, we'd just spend all your money down, and then the check for your coffin would bounce, right? So,
Right.
but we don't know that. So what can we do? What This job is all about matching assets, right? And an asset would be like your house, your money that you save in your 401k, any sort of cash, with your liabilities in your life. And your liabilities are, what are you going to pay for? How are you going to pay your mortgage? How are you going to get your kids through college? Traveling, all those kinds of things. So what we try to do is match the asset and the liability the best way we can. And
Right.
you're gonna have a spend down. So you're gonna, at some point, if you decide to retire, not work anymore, you're gonna be spending down your assets at some rate, and that's usually around 4 or 5% or so a year. So it's all about, how are we going to grow that capital, right, to get to where you can live on that 4 to 5% withdrawal.
Right.
Now you talk about people, and you talk about the people equation. So it's not just math, obviously. When
Right.
you think about people's motivation to spend money and the reasons to spend money, and what we find is that when people reach a certain age, and it's around, I'm going to say 75 or so, right?
Yeah.
They hit that age, all of a sudden, they're not as motivated to travel. Their bucket list has been weaned down, so their spending goes down. They get more
Yeah.
enjoyment out of hanging out at the house, being with their friends, that kind of thing. So
Right.
you have to build those kinds of behavioral tendencies into these plans.
Right.
So there's a lot going on there, and then there's also the challenge of the next generation, right? So, and I'm not
Right.
talking about Star Trek: The Next Generation, by the way. So don't, Mikhail, so don't get too excited. But anyway, not yet. I'm going to, but not yet.
Right.
And that
Oh, good.
is leaving money to your kids. What does it look like? What does it do to them? I think that it can, in a lot of ways, be a bit of a curse. It's very demotivating, or it can be. So, how do we have relationships with that generation and have some intelligent conversations about those kinds of things? So, it's a math challenge, and it's also a people equation, right? So,
Right. Right.
but it's a very fun job. It's a very, very fun job, and I really like it a lot.
Well, that also you answered the second part of that question without my posing it directly. So, which was, isn't it at the bottom line about mathematics and spreadsheets? Where does the human element play a role? And you just already explained that.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. Just to go back to the asset liability thing.
Yeah.
Um, I do this same work for Pacific Lutheran University, which is a small private college in Tacoma, Washington. They have an endowment.
Right.
And I think when you have a situation like that, John, your Rice has a very large endowment, about 6
Right.
billion. The endowment at PLU is about 140 million.
Hmm.
But in matching assets and liabilities, it's all a function of looking at what drives cost increases at the school,
Right.
and that's obviously inflation, having to pay faculty more, and the rising cost of housing and feeding the kids and stuff. And you try to match it with a liability that will, excuse me, with an asset that will rise as inflation goes up. So there's a lot to it.
Right.
It's very interesting work, though.
Well, in a sense, then you're really combining human behavior and mathematics. You're not trying to mathematicize necessarily people's behavior, although sounds like there is a little bit of an aspect to that. And you could say that that's exactly what, for example, life insurance companies do, because they invest heavily in actuarial calculations and data-driven solutions and so forth.
Absolutely. And they're doing the same thing. They're investing in a general account. They're using tables and assumptions and mathematics to figure out what people's life expectancies are, and they're managing a gap, as it were, right? So
Yeah.
it's very similar work.
So next topic is a kind of different, and this is more about some of the mechanics of finance and wealth, and it's both a historical and a future question. Wealth has been stored and moved in lots of different ways across the millennia, and it's gone from very concrete to very abstract. Barter being the first, which is very concrete, and then moving on to things like precious metals or gems or other items of real or perceived value. Specie is a way of standardizing precious metals into coin. And then alongside of that, there was metal bars being standardized as bullion, also valued mainly by the metal content. And then widespread use of paper money is much more recent. But and at first, of course, its perceived value was tied to a promise the paper money could be redeemed for bullion or for coin. And then we've segued to pure paper money backed only by the faith essentially of the government that prints it out. And that abstraction really took hold, of course, when the controversial departure from the gold standard happened. And that led to, well, much less discontinuity than some people expected it to. Now we go toward cryptocurrency and NFTs and things that are even more, in a sense, pure abstractions than paper money. And now crypto has come under fire, probably justified in the sense of maybe it expanded too quickly. But what do you think the future looks like for, let's say, government-backed currency, whether it's paper or electronic, or cryptocurrency? Where do you see that going in the context that we have nations that are in some cases smaller than corporations, and we have concerns about borders and taxation and so forth? Talk a little bit about how you see that moving.
Well, John, as you said, maybe indirectly, that fiat currency, right, which is
Yeah,
the type of currency that we use, it's the ultimate trust me trade, right? It's like,
right,
trust me, this dollar's worth a dollar, I promise,
right.
kind of a
Hmm.
thing, because there's actually nothing backing it.
Right,
You mentioned that we were at one point on the gold standard where all of our currency was backed by gold, a certain amount of gold, and you could
right,
actually go to a bank and you could exchange your currency for gold. That added a lot of volatility to the economy,
hmm,
and it also severely limited government's ability to control their individual economies. So
right,
when we created fiat currency and it became the way that we have decided, I guess, to transact business, it gave governments the ability to manage their economy by either increasing or decreasing the amount of currency out there in the world, and also, interest rates, controlling interest rates. So there's
right,
monetary and fiscal ways to control the economy. So
right. Yeah,
it's actually a really great way to it has created a lot of really interesting tools for governments, right? So but when does
right.
that start? What's the limit to that? Because there's always limits
Hmm.
to everything, right? Well, the
Right,
limit is if in a situation like we are now, where there's just government spending is just off the chain, it gets to a point where, well, gosh, what is it really backing this currency if all you're doing is spending money, right? So
right.
the good news is that as debt has gone up, the amount of equity in the world has actually gone up faster. So the balance sheet's just gotten bigger, more debt, but a
Oh,
lot more
yeah,
equity, right? So you don't hear about that a lot, but that's absolutely true. So in other words, the value of the US economy is bigger. The value of all the companies in the US is a lot bigger as debt has gone up. It's sort of like, you hear economists talk about, oh, there's so much credit card debt today. And that's true. But the thing is there's also a lot more home equity. There's a lot
hmm,
bigger balances in 401k accounts and
right,
that kind of thing. So that's good. But you can get to a point where there's just too much spending. So people
right.
question the value of currency.
Hmm.
And that really happens when the government's trying to stimulate growth by lowering interest rates, because there's
Right.
less backing a dollar or any currency when rates are
Hmm.
going down. So that's what makes Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, it can make it kind of sexy, right? Because
Hmm.
it's not backed by a government. So as interest rates go lower, crypto starts making sense. Crypto can make a lot of sense too in countries where they don't have a stable banking system, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
some of the countries in South America, for example. So if there's a way to transact or to hit payroll by not using a home currency, that can be very, very attractive when there's a lot of inflation. And I'm sure you've heard stories about, you went to go buy a loaf of bread and in a country with a lot of inflation, and by the time you got to the store, the price had gone up. And
Right.
those things happen. They can happen. So, but here's the thing: in the U.S., at least for now, we have a very stable banking system, and the dollar is the de facto currency of the world. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think that we will come to a point where we're just going to realize that we can't spend money like we have been doing.
Hmm.
We need to shrink the
Yeah.
size of the government. I mean, it's just a logical
Yeah.
thing to happen. I don't know
Right.
what the catalyst will be for it, but I think you will see that.
Right.
But here's the point. The point is that currency is a super efficient way to transfer wealth from one group to the other. And I think that we're going to continue to see that throughout the future. So when we're on Mars or Saturn or whatever, we will be transacting in one way or the other. A
Right.
debit goes in, a credit, goes out, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I
It
don't
has
see
to
any
be. Yeah.
stop to that. Yeah, I would think so.
John, I have just a quick question for
Yeah.
Ben, and that's the currency. So Ben, in the Middle East, especially a few countries here, Kuwait being one and Oman, the value of the dollar is actually much higher than the US, right? So then you have like in Kuwait, it's one Kuwaiti dinar is $3. So I just have a question about having a currency or dollar worth that much in oil-based economies. What's your prediction in, these countries having such a high value for their dollar?
So I'm assuming that you're talking about the way that, in particular, one commodity, crude oil, is traded between countries.
Right.
And
And it's, yeah.
at this point, the dollar is the basis for all trade in crude oil. So it's so much per barrel USD. That's the way it's traded. So that's one of the things that makes the US dollar the leading currency in the world. And there's a concept that the BRIC countries, the emerging countries, are working on, to where they would create a currency that was not associated with the dollar, that could be used to trade crude oil. And, we'll see if that's something that would happen. China is one of those countries that's involved in that project.
There's another instance where I see a few countries that are jumping on the bandwagon of trying to trade in other currencies besides the US dollar.
Yeah,
Do you think that's going to
exactly.
have a huge
Well, look,
impact?
I think over time that's certainly a possibility. I mean, if you look at the growth rates of India and China in particular, they're going to be an even larger percentage of the world population if things continue. And one of the problems, Elon Musk actually talks about this a lot, is the birth rates going down so much, especially in countries like Italy, that it's basically a replacement problem where people are dying quicker than babies are being born. So the reduction of population in some countries is a massive economic problem. Some countries just don't have that problem as much as others, and those emerging economies have the advantage of having a younger demographic as well. And I think that if that were to continue, that would raise a possibility that potentially there would be a replacement currency. I think we're 100 years away from it or so. One of the books that I really enjoyed reading, got a lot out of, was the Three Body Problem trilogy, which is just an amazing book. It was written by a Chinese author, actually. One of the biggest things I got out of that book, which was are you guys familiar with Three Body Problem?
No.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
Mikhail, of course you are.
That's a really novel, I think, novel way of thinking, and some of the concepts are pretty interesting.
They're
and
incredible.
never
It's
explored.
a mind-blowing book. It's a book about, we get note that there's an alien civilization coming to Earth, but it's going to take them like 400 years to get to Earth. And so we have that long to get ready for this thing to happen. But what I got out of this book was sort of the Chinese mindset. When you're reading a book about China, about somebody who is Chinese, obviously, and their extremely long-term outlook on the world, much different than here. When you read a book like that, which, by the way, it's being turned into a series by Netflix, so that'll be really great.
Wow.
They think it's going to be as big as Game of Thrones, by the way. That's how great this book is. But when you get a sense for the long-term planning of that country, and you compare it to the short-term planning here, relatively speaking, you can't help but open your mind to the possibility that things like replacement currencies are a possibility. But again, I'm going to say, give it 100 years and let's see where we are. I think it's that kind of a time frame.
Right. That's so cool to talk about that. So I almost hate to move to the next question, but it's related in the sense that there's the individual view of what does a person or a family do to build enough wealth to be able to retire, to be able to do good things for progeny and so forth. And doing good things for the community is totally connected to that. And you're a member of the board at a place called Cross Purpose in Denver. It says on its site, it's the mission of Cross Purpose is abolishing economic, relational, and spiritual poverty through career and community development in Denver. Can you tell us more about that, and whether it's a charity or it's some other kind of form of organization, and what is relational and spiritual poverty? For example, can somebody be economically wealthy but poor relationally, and vice versa? And what about intellectual wealth and the quality and quantity of ideas? That's a pretty convoluted question, but dive in there and see what you can tell us.
It's pretty heady stuff, John.
It is.
And I will go into it. I'm going to tell you what Cross Purpose does, and then I'm going to boil it down to a math equation. So how's that? Or a math concept.
Okay.
So we'll do it that way.
That would be great.
Yes. So Cross Purpose is a nonprofit. So it is, I guess you call it a charity. And it's really all about job training. Okay. So what we do is we take people into our program, and it's a 6-month commitment. It's free. No one ever pays. And we actually give people a small stipend every month to sort of help them get through the program. The first 6 weeks of the program are what we call personal development. And, what do you learn to do in personal development? You learn how to open a bank account, how to shake hands, how to write a resume, how to interview, how to use PowerPoint. It's basically life skills. It's how to function in society, and who would need this. So let's talk about, our participants. These are people that, in most cases, I would say, they're disadvantaged. They started that way and it was not of their own doing. Most of it is people who just didn't have the advantage of a stable home life, didn't have parents at home. So it's people that grew up on the streets, basically, ended up joining a gang, ended up selling drugs to survive. It would be anything that we would have to do to survive if we were in the same situation, right? And they get to a point in their life where, I need more stability. I want to have a way to raise my children, own a home, save money, retire, all those sorts of things that, we probably think about every day, So we bring them in, and during the 6-week period, this personal development, you get to pick your skill track. So maybe it's one of the trades: welding, plumbing, carpentry. It could be working as a nursing assistant. It could be working as a legal assistant, medical billing and coding, all sorts of career opportunities, about 20. And you're deemed a graduate of the program if you get a job in the field that you trained in that is above what we consider a livable wage. So it's in the $20 to $25 an hour category with benefits. So, with medical and with benefits, you're a graduate of the program. And we're one of the most successful career development nonprofits really in the country. Our graduation rate's very high, but it's expensive love, we like to call it. It costs about $20,000 to get somebody through the program. So It's not inexpensive, but you know what? We want people to get out of, obviously, financial poverty. We want them to get out of relational poverty, which is simply having friends, having people that that you can relate to and talk to. It's challenging for a lot of people. There was some research done. It was a write-up in the New York Times about it. One of the best ways to get out of financial poverty is to have relationships. To have relationships with people outside of your socioeconomic current situation, business owners, professionals. As you build your social capital, you tend to build your financial capital. So we really encourage that. Spiritual poverty can be defined as someone who doesn't have that rudder in the water, doesn't have a reason to get up in the morning, sort of a thing. And so we help with that as well. So let's take this down to a math equation. Mikhail, you got very excited when I said that. But maybe it's just a mathematical concept, and that is, we're just trying to get people up Maslow's pyramid, right? The foundation of the pyramid is just getting by, and as you go up the pyramid and you start meeting your sort of base needs, you can generate and create intellectual wealth. The quality and quantity of ideas certainly increase. So, the intellectual capital of society improves as you help people in getting out of financial poverty, and they have a more well-rounded life. And I think it's just extremely important to help people in this way. And it's something I've done for a long time. Not only am I on the board, but I'm also a volunteer and have worked as a volunteer for 7 or 8 years now. So it's something that's very important to me. And my wife and I do it together, actually. So it's a really, really cool, really neat thing that's happening in Denver.
What you said about getting people to be able to move upward in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that the intellectual quality of society increases with each individual who is able to make improvements in him or herself. That is a concept that I actually really appreciate the mathematical aspect of that as well, because it makes it much harder to refute the sense that really we do need to bring people up. Being in a bimodal society with a bunch of have-nots and a few haves and not much in between, that is an unhealthy society to be in. But when people engage in a sort of Darwinian approach to running society, we move away from that, and I'm afraid we do so at our own peril. Can you talk about how you represent this organization, for example, to folks who are unfamiliar with need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you bring up a lot of interesting points here. And let's talk about the intellectual power of survival a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I've had these types of conversations with people in our program. You picture someone who has never had a bank account or a social security number in their life,
my.
right? Okay. And they have figured out how to have an apartment, have a car, basically how to function in society to where you wouldn't ever know that this person never had a bank account before. And they've navigated through this system in a way that is actually really impressive.
Yeah.
And a lot of the way, one of the ways they do that is obviously they sell drugs.
Right.
But if you think about selling drugs, you think about so many aspects, economic aspects of that occupation, right. I guess you could call it. You got to worry about supply and demand and pricing and regulation and not getting caught and all of these things. And when you combine it with the fact that, and I'm navigating through life without a bank account or, without any sort of government ID at all, man, right. If you can do that, maybe I should hire you because you're pretty darn smart.
Right.
But if I can't hire you, let me show you how to navigate society in a different way. And I think that explains why for every dollar somebody gives to cross purpose, the societal impact is a positive $10. You've got people that are going from taking some sort of subsidy from the government to paying in to the system. That's incredibly powerful. And let me tell you what it does for people is it gives them a lot of self-satisfaction, a lot of pride, a lot of happiness. And it's something that we want to be multi-generational. The kids see it, their kids see it. You're building people up for success. And I think it's really important. And here's the thing, and I really want to emphasize this, John. We can't depend on the government to do this work. It's the government's just a big, huge bureaucracy that really, I don't know, doesn't really get things done like it should, in my opinion. This is a private sector problem, and we need to solve it in the private sector. Because, and you said this, you hinted to this, society is so much better when people are successful in that society on a more uniform basis than having a bunch of haves and a bunch of have-nots. That's very suboptimal.
Yes.
Very suboptimal.
Well, if you don't have if you want to just be bluntly business-like, you can say, look, Mr. or Ms. Billionaire, if we don't have a middle class, the basis of your wealth is going to reduce because you won't have anybody to sell to.
That's right. So poor Jeff Bezos isn't going to have anybody to sell to. And what's curious is that the government program with the biggest return in the history of the United States is the GI Bill.
Yes.
Because what did the GI Bill do? It created wealth, it created a middle class, it created a way for people to get training, to go out and get high-paying jobs. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So it's a 6-month program, not a 4-year program, but you know what? You get through this program, and then we have a lot of ancillary services after you graduate. We have an alumni association. We help people buy homes. We show them how to invest money. We have counseling. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of follow-through things that we do with our alumni that to increase the odds of success to even a higher number.
Well, and then you get the effect of the people who benefited from the system turning around and benefiting the program.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be more convincing to the people who need to look at the program and come into it than any middle-aged white guy wandering around saying, hey, can I help you?
Oh, absolutely. And I will say this, and a lot of our skill tracks, and that would be CDL, commercial driver license.
Yeah.
And like CNA, a lot of the medical fields, we have employers that come to us and say, we will take all of your graduates.
Yes.
We'll take them all. So let's talk about supply demand here, right? We're just helping to bring that supply demand equation more in line with where it needs to be. And absolutely, it helps society, it helps everyone.
Well, I'm going to turn this over to Mikhail because he has a completely different question.
Now, then
Can't
just
wait.
a couple thoughts on the previous conversation. So what I see is also talking about math again, the multiplication effect, right? So it's not about, it's very important and it's critical helping people individually and raising them up, but it creates multiplication effect. And hopefully it's a virtuous cycle where they or other people in their circle see what is possible, and that creates even more demand and more people look up, and that raises not just individuals but the whole groups. So that this
Absolutely.
is very important. Great job you're doing that.
How many people have you graduated so far, Ben?
About 800.
Oh man, wow.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see like an equal distribution between men and women in the programs?
We aim for that. We have probably about a quarter of our lead, we call them leaders, people that go through the program, have some gang affiliation. Probably a little less than that have been incarcerated at one point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to attempt to cater to a demographic that has the highest odds of graduating, we would probably tilt the program toward single mothers.
Right.
Because single mothers tend to really just succeed at a very high level in our groups, because they don't have a choice. They've gotten to a point where they don't have a choice. They've got to get through it. But we don't do that. We give everybody a chance to get through the program. Male, female, we'll take anyone from any background, any country. We actually had a guy last year that wasn't in one of my groups, but he was from Afghanistan. He worked with our U.S. military. He was a helicopter pilot there. He came to the U.S. and funny enough, he could fly a helicopter, but he couldn't drive a car, which I thought was very funny. But anyway, he got a CDL, his commercial driver's license, and he's now working at the airport, the DIA, working as a commercial driver there. So cool. We will literally take, if you qualify for the program, we'll take you.
That's an awesome program.
Ben, you mentioned already the three-body problem by Csikszentmihalyi, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Let's broaden the horizons here.
Okay.
That the modern investment structure arguably started around the 1600s, but the roots can be found very, very early as the ancient Babylonia, 18th century, before Christian era, and the Code of Hammurabi. Now, obviously, this is an integral mechanism of our life and our wealth preservation and growth. Do you see this as the fundamental mechanism in the future? Let's think about next 2-3 centuries going forward. Will we still define wealth the same way?
Wow, Mikhail, I'm so glad you asked that question. That's a great question. And I think that what you call the modern investment structure or the way that the world economy has kind of evolved it's evolved to do two things really efficiently. And the first one is, how are you going to pay for stuff? So I think that the economy that has morphed over time is just a really awesome way to pay for stuff. It's so easy. It's so seamless. It's so one button, easy to pay for stuff. I also think that it has encouraged people over time to do a very important thing, and that is to specialize in something. So as opposed to living out in the woods on your own and having to do everything, create your shelter and hunt and do all these things, we've created a society where I'm really good at X or Y or Z, and that's what I'm going to do because it's going to maximize my utility. So from a utility maximizing standpoint, I do think that there's going to be some form of this as we go, into the future. And it's kind of cool to me the way science fiction incorporates this concept. Like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Red Mars trilogy by Robinson. It's been out for a while, but it's about the colonization of Mars. And one of the ways that it's paid for is that they create a reality TV show. And everybody on Mars is on this reality TV show, and it helps to pay for the mission. So you get this sense of, I got to pay for all this stuff. How am I going to do it? So, you see that concept. Obviously, Dune, very famous book, Dune, is all about economics. It's like, who's going to be able to control the supply of a commodity that everybody wants?
So you find something of value
Yes,
right? And
exactly.
it could be
And
different in different ages
that's right.
or
And yeah,
societies.
different constructs, different realities, however you want to see it. But, it also answers a very important question, and that is, how are you going to motivate people, right? So there's a book called Beyond Star Trek that came out like about 10 years ago that I read, and it tries to explain the concepts behind the show. And we're all very familiar with the show. And one of the things is in the Next Generation series, they have, this thing called holodeck, where you can, earn time in the holodeck or take your vacations in the holodeck and basically kind of create whatever reality you want. And the author of Beyond Star Trek, one of his arguments is, if there was really a holodeck, no one would ever leave it, right? Because you can create whatever reality you want, any experience you want. Like, sounds pretty great to me, right? But here's the thing, right? What about the holodeck repair guy? I mean, you're going to have a holodeck repair guy. So you're going to have to motivate that guy somehow. So how are you going to do that? Right. So probably some way economically is probably the way you do it. So I know that Star Trek always says, oh, we have no need for money and all that stuff. That is just not, that's not in any way in any type of reality that I can see. And actually, in some of the Star Trek novels, there was one Star Trek novel that I read about these renegade Vulcans. And the way they got rich was by they figured out how to trade commodities. Like they created these quantitative ways to trade commodities. So I'm like, okay, now that I get, right? If you need a bunch of money, then you figure out how to make that bunch of money, and then you can go out and buy stuff. So yeah, I think this is pretty much here to stay. Now, that's not to say that maybe we won't have universal, basic income, or there's been some talk about that, especially with AI, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I
Yeah.
think it would only fulfill very, very base needs and not pay for cool stuff that we all want, like Rolex watches and Teslas and stuff like that.
Right.
So, and that leads perfectly to my next question. And as you started talking Star Trek, so this is exactly what I had in mind. And actually, that holodeck repair service could be performed by AI.
Absolutely.
You don't need anything there anymore. But imagine that a scenario from Star Trek, right? So if something like a replicator is invented, and suddenly anyone can get any object, anything, anytime, anywhere, anything they want for free. What will it mean for wealth management and for the definition of what is wealth and what has value? Do you think in that case physical objects will lose any value, and we will need to create new mechanisms to define this relational and spiritual wealth? Maybe that will serve as the new mechanism that we're going to exchange. What other future scenarios of redefining wealth can you imagine in that case?
Sure. So bringing up the old replicator, huh? So
or
so
nanofabricator. In 3D printing circles, people dream about nanofabricator, right? So imagine
sure.
3D printing at the nano level, because you have your the chemical elements, your protons, neutrons, electrons, it's everywhere. So if you can just reassemble them into something else, would that be possible? Would that be a dreamlike mechanism or machine, however you call it, a printer?
Well, I mean, here's the thing about replicators. So let's go back to the fundamental rules of replication, right? So as a longtime watcher of the show, right, you can't say, "Hey, replicator, make me a phaser," because that's too complicated. You can get a replicator to replicate some of the pieces of the phaser, and then you have to put it together. So first of all, am I in agreement that that is accurate? Because my whole thesis is built on this assumption. So am I correct that a replicator can't make a phaser completely by itself? Do I get any buy-in on this?
I think this is something we could stretch, and as a thought exercise, that there are two paths here. One is, okay, there is a limitation to what is possible, and we could build some maybe materials or simple structures, but
right.
Not something extremely complicated. But in the other scenario, you can say, well, what if I have unlimited power and unlimited way of assembling these molecules or elementary particles into anything I want?
Okay.
What would happen then?
Let's use something a little bit more simple than a phaser. Let's make it a pizza. So let's say, your replicator can make a pizza. I think we can all agree with that, right? So I can order a pizza anytime I want. Okay. So there's two sort of, things behind that, two scenarios you could say behind that. Scenario one is my replicator can create a pizza, but when it does that, all the flour molecules and the water molecules and the cheese molecules that I have in my position, the population of those goes down. So basically, I'm taking a raw commodity and making a finished good out of it. Now, one form of replication is, I guess, me calling Pizza Hut and having them deliver the pizza. But instead of me having to pay for my replicator pizza with the supplies, I just use some sort of fiat currency of some sort, kind of a deal. But if you're going to make it easier for me to get a pizza, I'll probably eat more pizza. So if scenario one is intact, then I'm just going to have a lot less flour and cheese and stuff. And I would think the value of those things would go up. So things haven't really changed that much with the replicator, except things are a lot easier. Maybe I'm fatter because I'm not on Ozempic, although I'm sure they have Ozempic in Star Trek somewhere. That's a totally other discussion. If you're talking about a replicator that can just create things out of air or create things out of any kind of molecule, that's a different story than
space dust.
Then space dust would be a lot more valuable maybe. But, if you're creating value, then the things that you use to create value are going to be more valuable, right? So, I think it would create a scenario where I think people would look at wealth differently. And the good part of my heart would say, well, maybe people would just be a little bit more satisfied with the possibility of having whatever they want. But at the end of the day, I think it comes back to the whole motivation question. And there's a limit to living in a paradise where you have to do very little to get something in return. It's like at some point, somebody's got to create a technology that allows you to do that. How are you going to motivate them to do that? So in a lot of ways, things would change, but in a few very significant ways, nothing would change. So that's the answer I'm going to go with, Mikhail. I hope that's not disappointing to you.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think what we talked about earlier, Maslow hierarchy of needs, basically with this technology, with that thought experiment, the most basic needs are met by everyone in that scenario. So that goes away, but the hierarchy still stays, right? You still need that intellectual and spiritual attainment and some different goals and different motivation that you need to find. That doesn't go anywhere. So hopefully in that scenario, we reorient ourselves to meeting more of those other needs that currently are on top of that pyramid.
Yeah, I think, and this is something that my wife actually said, which I thought was particularly insightful. She said, everybody needs problems to solve. And if you don't have a problem to solve, you'll make one up. You'll create a problem to solve. And I think that's just a need it's a need that we have. We have this intellectual capacity, unlike, no other species on the planet that we know of has, right? That we can change things and we need to exercise that ability. That's how we're built. That's how we're made.
So we should make this into a law and name it after your wife.
Jana's Law.
Jana's.
Okay. Jana's Law.
Law.
Yeah. Jana's Law. Yeah. I'm there. I'm totally tracking with you, John.
How do you spell her name?
It's just like banana, but it's a Jana. You know what I mean?
Okay, so, yeah.
Jana. Right. Yep. There you
go.
John will create a Wikipedia page.
Yes, exactly. There you go.
I think Amanda has the next question.
Yes.
I can't wait.
So
we're going to go into even crazier territory now.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
This is the fun part, Ben. So we had this amazing conversation so far about wealth management, wealth inequality, currencies. And actually, I'm just really, really excited of what you're doing with Cross Purpose. I think it's amazing. And I want to talk or get into about what fascinates you and look into the future of that. So in this little topic, I really want to use your imagination, right? So there's a quote that imagination will take us everywhere. And I really want you to take our listeners of this podcast in a journey of your imagination. So I want to talk a little bit about trends in society, and we can do trends in wealth management if, that's what you want to talk about. What trends do you see in wealth that can change our future as human beings in, say, the next 50 years, 100 years, or even 200 years into the future by the year 2222? Even if we survive then or not, where do you think society is going in terms of wealth and wealth management?
Well, this topic really really makes me want to talk about AI. So I'm going to talk about AI,
Sure. Yeah,
artificial
sure.
intelligence, and you probably have had AI experts on this program, but and I'm not one of those. But
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about AI and what it is and what it isn't. And first of all, the A stands for artificial. So it's not real intelligence, it's artificial intelligence. It's like artificial sweetener. Like it
Right.
may be sweet, but it's not actually sugar. So AI is an amazing tool, and it's like a lot of other technologies. It's really just a lever. It helps you to leverage yourself and your efforts. And give me a lever and I'll move the world, it's propelled us as a society for millennia. And what AI has the capability of doing is to make the economy much more efficient, make economic growth much higher than it is, because from a resource standpoint, it enables companies and individuals to do things they couldn't do before, maybe just do them a lot quicker. And I think about a couple of applications in design, for example. If you want to design a rocket engine, you're going to do it much faster with AI because it's able to go through all the iterations and solve for the biggest challenge in space travel as we know it today, which is generating enough thrust with the amount of weight that you need to generate that thrust. At this point, only about 3 or 4% of the weight of a rocket is the payload.
Wow.
I know the other is fuel, and it's the actual rocket itself. So it's tough. And here's kind of an interesting thing. If the Earth was just a little bit bigger, we would never be able to go into space because of the gravity, because we wouldn't have anything that generated enough thrust to get us out of the atmosphere. So we're kind of in a sweet spot where we can do that, but it's very challenging, right? And I think AI is going to give us the ability to create technologies faster that will enable us to make space travel more realistic, more of a reality. So I'm excited about it. I'm not as concerned about artificial intelligence as some people are. I know Elon Musk is very concerned about it. And in fact, that's one of the things that really motivated him to buy Twitter. He bought Twitter for the data because it has so much data, and he was afraid that people might take that data and create AI technologies, because all it does is gobble up a bunch of data and then come up with conclusions that could have some very negative outcomes, right? So
Right.
artificial intelligence, I don't think that there's a Skynet possibility in the future where it turns on us and becomes sentient, all that. I think that if you tend to not be a religious person, then I would tell you that it's taken billions of years for mankind to develop self-awareness, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight in a computer.
Mm.
If you're a religious person, I would say that God gave us self-awareness, that he's given no one else that we know of self-awareness. And to think that a man could give a machine self-awareness is just the ultimate folly, in my opinion. So I'm a little bit more bullish than most people on that technology. I do think it's going to result in an economic growth and technological innovation that's very exciting to me.
So I have some disadvantages of AI, and I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about that because you mentioned the efficiency being a top advantage. But what about AI and not allowing humans to problem solve? So I have used, just Microsoft Bing AIs to write letters. And, I can generate a letter in, a couple minutes, whereas if I didn't have AI, I would have to go through first draft, second draft, and try to get this wording correctly. And the thing with humans is that that process of being able to problem solve and that process of being able to work through difficulties is in part of why we are advancing as human beings as we are now. So do you see with AI, eventually our technology innovation is going to taper off and we're just going to depend on machines for everything?
Well, let me answer that question in a couple of different ways. First of all, technology doesn't always follow a straight line, right? It takes a lot of people working very hard to advance any kind of technology. A great example of that is, and this is mind blowing. Think about the last time we were on the moon. It was 1969, and no one's even landed on the moon since then. And it's because of a lack of technological innovation. We just haven't made that a priority. So technology doesn't necessarily follow a straight line up all the time, right? I think there are more restrictions of AI than most people realize. So, for example, there's been a lot of automation attempts in, say, the auto industry, right? And what's been learned from this exercise is that the ability of a person to see something on an assembly line that's not working, to turn around and to pick out the tool they need and to hold that tool in their hand and to go over and make an adjustment to some piece of machinery is way more efficient than if you had a robot do it. So these higher level problem solving activities, I think, are going to remain in the human realm, while the less intense problem solving can be sort of subcontracted over to the AI route.
Okay.
That's my
I
thought.
see. Right.
Now, my oldest son, Troy, did a very funny thing on AI. He asked it to write a script for his favorite show, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And he just said, hey, write a 30, about them going on a treasure hunt. And it was actually really good. It was a really good episode with all the characters, and they said things that you would think they would say. And so, yeah, that's a little problematic, right? Because you're talking about people's intellectual property being violated, and I think there's going to be some issues there.
Right.
But I would contend that the advantages of the technology, outweigh these types of disadvantages, and we just need to be intelligent problem solvers when it comes to AI.
Right. And keep the more complicated stuff for us humans with brains.
Can I ask one more?
Yes,
one more
yes,
Please do.
question? We've seen in maybe last decade or so, specifically in financial circles and investing, where all these AI programs, algorithms, they now influence so much that day trading and just the amount of transactions that they do is just, I think, exponentially increasing at this point. What do you think about that trend? Where would that go?
Gosh, Mikhail, you just read my mind. So don't
That's
know if
what
you
I
used
do.
AI to do that or not, but there's actually a study that just came out like 3 days ago on this very topic. And it ends up that AI is just not at this point a great tool for trying to figure out what the market's going to do. There's a number of firms that have tried it and just have not made any progress there at all. I think that if you look at the behavior of markets, they do resemble some natural processes. Probably the closest thing that you can find to the behavior of markets is, believe it or not, found in traffic patterns. The way that if you have a certain density of people driving on the same road, you're going to get a lot of starts and stops, and it's going to be like, why are we stopping? Why are we slowing down? And it's just very hard to figure that out. And I know people that have used a technology that is specific to figuring out traffic patterns that's actually been pretty successful in trading. The other technology is speech recognition, and in particular, computers trying to figure out what I'm most likely to say next. So you take a sentence like, I'm hungry, I'm going to go to the blank. So what's, a logical thing for me to say, restaurant or store or something. So using a technology that harkens back to speech recognition, that's been a very successful sort of angle in terms of trying to figure out markets, but a pure AI approach has not been successful at this point. So we'll have to see.
Interesting. Thank you, Ben.
Welcome.
So I believe, what you're saying is that you do see AI continuing to improve and exist in the next, 50 years or so, and with humans solving the main problems, but using AI for the, smaller problems. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk on time travel. So let's talk a little bit about going forward and backward in time, and your thoughts on time travel. So I'll start by asking you, do you think that actual time travel is possible? And if yes, do you think that we can only go forward in time, backward in time, or both ways? And if we can go back in time, what sort of paradoxes are there of traveling in the past? So we'll start with that one first. Just tell us your your ideas of whether you think time travel is possible.
Well, it's funny you asked that because I'm currently traveling forward in time right now. So,
Yeah.
but that doesn't really make me unique because it seems like everybody's going forward at a very, very similar rate, actually. So, I want to give you a scientific answer to this question, which I just love this question. I'm so glad that you asked me because most of the time when I'm hanging out with people, they don't ask me about time travel. So this gives me a chance to talk about it. So
Right.
I think there's only one way that we're going to figure out the whole time travel thing, and that is through gravitons. So a graviton is a particle that gives things gravity. So if you have gravitons, you have a gravitational field, things will respond like they're under a certain g-force, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the way that you would use gravitons is if you were able to warp the time in front of you by ejecting a beam of gravitons. You could wrinkle space, and by wrinkling space, you would be wrinkling time as well, and it would give you the ability to potentially go forward in time and potentially go backward in time. But harvesting the power of gravitons would change society in like so many ways. I mean, all of a sudden we'd be able to travel in space as much as we wanted. We would be able to lift things very easily, right? Because you just turn on your graviton beam and pick up an elephant or a big, huge piece of machinery or something like that. It would change things. I think that the bad part of that is, there's a certain point where, you become a god with a little g, right? I mean, you become like something more than a human at that point. You think about conquistadors landing, and meeting the Incan civilization, and the Incans thinking that they were gods because they had this amazing technology. They were able to sail across the ocean and things like that. I mean, this would propel us into a zone that's just really hard for me to fathom how we would even control that kind of power, right? So the most recent Star Trek series features a transporter that like you don't even have to stop walking. You just like transport from one place to the other, and it's like something a god could do, like a superhero or something. I don't think that society could handle that kind of power, and I think that that power would eventually destroy us.
Right.
So I actually hope that we don't get to that point, because I think it's just like giving a nuclear weapon to a baby. I don't think if we would ever be able to harness that kind of power. That's my view. Now, let's talk about the paradoxes a little bit because I love talking about this too. So there's several theories about reality, and one of them is that there's multiple realities, there's multiple outcomes. So if you were to pop backward and forward in time, you would actually pop backward and forward in time in those different realities. And that really kind of puts the kibosh on the paradox thing. So going back and killing your grandmother kind of deal, and then what would happen to you? Would you disappear? Well, no, because you did that in a different parallel reality, so that in that parallel reality you wouldn't be born, but in the parallel reality you came from, you'd still be there. And I kind of see that as my intellectual way to deal with time travel. And believe it or not, it all comes down to the size and the weight of gravitons. If they're bigger than a certain size, then there's one reality. If they're smaller than a certain size, there's multiple realities, and we don't know that yet. But I'm gonna stay with the multiverse on this one. So that gets rid of the paradox problem.
So Ben, you basically talking about many worlds interpretation.
Yes,
Quantum
exactly.
Mechanics, right?
Exactly. Right. That's exactly right.
And there's still a lot of arguments and people don't understand. But if you think about quantum mechanical equations, the time there is not, you can write them forward in time, backward in time. It's all symmetrical. There's nothing that prevents the process to go backwards. And actually there are structures that people call time crystals in that level, with quantum mechanical structures that can just go through different configurations back and forth without losing energy or without creating heat. Heat is the biggest problem here with the arrow of time as people perceive it. So no, I really like that idea with the many worlds interpretation. I think there's a lot of merit here, and maybe this is how we should look at it.
Yeah, maybe so. But usually the Occam's razor, right, which is the simplest answer, is usually the most accurate one, holds true. And just to give you a quick example of that, I don't know if it's really relates to time travel, but people suddenly disappearing. Okay, I don't mean like vanishing, but I mean, your cousin all of a sudden didn't show up for school and no one saw him since, and it was 20 years ago. Those things happen, right? They happen. There's lots and lots of cases of those happening. But here's the thing that's interesting about that. If you take a map of the US and you look at a density map of people who suddenly disappeared, and you overlay that with a map of the US of underground caverns, they line up with almost a 1.0 correlation. So you can make all kinds of assumptions about people suddenly disappearing. Well, maybe they fell into a time warp, or maybe they're in another dimension or something, or maybe they fell down a hole. It just seems like falling down a hole is way more believable. And so I think I'm going to go with the hole. I think I'm going to go with the cavern situation. So,
and then there is spontaneous combustion.
You gotta love spontaneous combustion. I mean, you gotta love spontaneous combustion unless you're the one that's doing it. I mean, it's so cool, right? I mean,
so I really enjoy that, Ben, especially with talking about the graviton. That's a whole new concept for me, and just harnessing that power and what it can mean for us humans if it's possible. So the last part of the question has to deal with actually, imagination and time travel. So let's say you actually could harness the power of gravitons, or we can go a little bit Hollywood and say, what if a time travel machine suddenly appears in front of you and you had a chance to take just one trip, either forward in time or backward in time, and it doesn't have to be within your lifetime? Where will you go? Or when will you go, and why?
Wow. Gosh, Amanda, do you have any? That's like the hardest question I've ever heard.
But it's the most fun, though.
Yeah, it is. It's a very hard question. So let's put some rules around this. Can I come back, or do I have to stay at where I'm going?
This is the first time someone asked me. You can actually come back. How about that?
You can come back. Yeah, yes. You can come back.
Yes.
We'll give you that.
Yes.
Okay. So this is what I would probably do. And this harkens to a really interesting thing. One of the things that I think about is, how far back could you go and be able to like interact with people and understand people and eat the food and things like that, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, it ends up it's not
a part of it.
It is not as far back as you think is the answer to that. So you could go back like 50 years, because I'm actually older than that. You could go back to like the 30s pretty easily, because look, I mean, there's movies that were made in the 30s, and people are talking and you can understand them and that kind of thing. If you went back, say sometime in the 19th century, you're going to start having some pretty significant problems with understanding people, even if it was in the US. And it would be really super hard to understand people if you were to like London in the 1800s, because language has changed so much. You would have a super hard problem with eating and drinking. I mean, if you don't believe me, go to Mexico and drink tap water and see what happens. In some places in Mexico, you just don't have the biodiversity in your gut to handle it, right? So, if we're going to be time travelers, you're probably going to need to take some supplies along, so we don't get sick. But one thing that I've really been intrigued with is I grew up in Florida, Northeast Florida, and there was a tribe of people called the Timucuan Indians, and they lived on a diet of almost exclusively protein. They were super healthy, and they had a really great life because there was so much food. They would eat, oysters and fish. They would, and there was just very few people in the world at that time. And I'd be super curious to see like what their culture was like. I mean, there's some remnants of their culture. They played a form of basketball. They had a lot of free time. And I would just be super curious to see what life was like with such a low population of humans, what the earth was like. There was a time when 150 years ago, not that long ago, when if you lived in the West, like we do, like I do, you didn't really want your kids to go out and play because they might get eaten. People looked at nature in a very different way back then, right? they looked at the world as an evil place because, if you fell down a pit or got bit by a rattlesnake, there's really no coming back from it. But I'd be really interested in seeing and observing the behavior of that society that I refer to, the Timucuan Indians. I think that's where I would go.
Neat.
Oh, that's amazing. So you said they were in northern Florida? Is that where they
Northeast
were?
Florida, so sort of on the Florida, Georgia sort of border there, on barrier islands
Right.
that are just off the main coast. And a lot of people say that, that was kind of like a paradise back then, right? Assuming you weren't from like a absolutely freaky society where people like to kill each other and eat each other or something like that. You can kind of
Right.
avoid those sorts of things. Maybe it wasn't so bad. It's just don't get a cold because, that's not good.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of germs introduced by Europeans into North America were,
Yeah.
well, in a sense, the first biowarfare, but that's another topic altogether.
Well, yeah, the best thing that ever happened to germs was actually the development of agriculture. Because before we grew stuff in the ground, all the bad germs were in the ground. And then when we started busting around with the ground and moving the soil around, there was an absolute renaissance of diseases back in those days. Absolute renaissance.
Well, this has been a very, very fun discussion, and I appreciate a bunch of things about it, Ben, such as talking about non-monetary value, but in a sense, not being able to escape monetary value because it's eventually everyone has to have some kind of motivation, and motivation involves trading. There's almost no getting away from it because you trade your time for some kind of value. The fungible nature of money allows you to do the specialization as you described. But at the same time, I think that in this conversation, we've made a pretty good case as a discussion group for the fact that even if basic needs are taken care of, there's still a lot of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I do think that's a good model for us to use. A lot of layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we still need to progress in order to feel like we've had a productive life or something to feel satisfied about.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And this is what I tell people that, clients or people that I know that like, man, I want to retire. They talk about retiring from their jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I always say is, you know what, if you want to retire, you got to have 4 things that you want to do with your time. 4 things. Okay. And I'll even give you one of the 4. And that one is taking care of your health, exercising and all that. Don't tell me you're going to play golf all the time because you're not going to be able to do that. But you got to have 4 things to give your life meaning.
Yeah.
To have motivation to get up in the morning, just like you're talking about. Very, very important. And if people don't have those 4 things, you got 2 options. You either figure out what those 4 things are going to be for you, or you keep working. And you know what? Most people keep working because there is satisfaction. There's satisfaction from, pleasure and things like that. There's also a lot of satisfaction from accomplishing things.
Oh, yes.
And it's just, it makes us who we are. It's very, very important.
Well, you're in good company, Ben, in the sense that several of the people we've talked with, and many of those have very STEM-oriented backgrounds, it still comes down to the human element of what are we doing, not just for ourselves, but for our world community. Because another thing that we've talked about in this conversation is essentially the rising tide lifts all boats. But what if our neighbor has a hole in his boat? Are we just going to let him sink? And
Right.
The idea then, if we do help our neighbors, we really are helping ourselves, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I mean it's just a reinforcement, a positive reinforcement loop when you help other people.
Yeah. Well, Amanda and Mikhail, do you have any further observations from the conversation or last moment questions?
No, I just want to thank you, Ben. That it's been a great conversation, very insightful, of interesting ideas. I'm still thinking about your idea behind time travel in a many worlds interpretation. I think there's something that I could explore in my science fiction writing in the future.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Well,
no,
as they say,
much.
You're a hard science fiction writer because your writing has a lot of really cool actual science in it, which I think is really super neato.
Yeah,
I
it sure
appreciate
is.
it.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So far, I mean, it's been an amazing conversation. We covered so much topics and interesting insights. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you guys for including me and inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
It's our pleasure. So how would people get in touch with you if they wanted to follow up on something they've listened to on this podcast?
Well, probably the easiest way is through email, and I will give you my work email is my initials BW at aveocapital.com, AVEO capital.com. And
Cool.
if anybody has any questions, please, I'd love to hear them.
If you had
Read them.
If you had one sentence you could say as some kind of message for the audience, what would you say?
I would really encourage people to be positive about the future and the potential of society. I know that this is a kind of a negative time. There's so much bad news in the world. There's a lot of frustration over politics, especially. There's fear about war and what's happening in Ukraine currently, and I certainly understand that. People have concerns about things like global warming, which we didn't even get into. I think that there is a shortage of positivity right now. Very understandably so, but I think there's a shortage of positivity, and I would love for people to try to think about the good outcomes. I think it makes you a more efficient person. I think it makes you a more successful person to have that mindset. And
Totally agree.
I encourage that mindset. I really do.
Well, that's awesome. And that's a great point where we can put a period, I think, on our conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vision 2222. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. Please also comment, and we'll do our best to respond.